SAM's a world leader in fatigue and perception of effort. Now, what was quite exciting for me last night was that my partner was excited about Sam coming up to Edinburgh, and she was going to get a chance to speak to Sam because she's an endurance athlete. Now, that shows how well Sam is recognised in the world of sport, that athletes know about his work because it's really important to endurance sport. So he's gone into common knowledge even in some of the work that he's done with his psychobiological model. But what I've asked Sam to do today is speak a little bit about sport, because we've got a mixed audience, a little bit about sport, and just as importantly, the application of his work to the health sciences as well, and how perception of effort and exercise is important in clinical environments. Now, after the presentation, there'll be a chance for questions, but if you would like to speak to Sam more, we will be going up to the McRobert for lunch, so you're more than welcome to join us at the McRobert. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for having me. This is my second time in Stirling, so it was nice to come here. Although last time was for an interview, so I didn't give a talk to everybody. Can I get this? Okay, so you don't see it. I see the timer. I'll move it here. Great. So as Andy said, I'm going to talk a little bit about endurance performance, but I want to give an overview of where perception of effort as, oops, this one? No. Sorry guys, I need to get, yeah, I think I need to do it. So an overview of, well, first of all, what perception of effort is, because there is confusion even about that, and relevance to endurance performance, but also health. And then I'll move into the biology of it, because although I do a lot of psychology these days, I'm actually originally a physiologist, so I'm always keen to understand the physiology of the psychological construct that I deal with. And if I have time, maybe a little bit of practical applications with a little bit of a relationship to doping. I think Paul DiMeo is here? No, because I know he's doing doping research, so it's kind of related to that. So first of all, what is perception of effort? Perception of effort is if you use like an overall definition that goes across sport, exercise, but also psychology, I think this is a very good one from Preston Varg in 2009. The conscious sensation of strain and labor is obviously a feeling, so a subjective feeling that intensifies the harder the person tries. And the important thing, effort must feel coming from within the person. And of course, we're going to mainly talk about perception of effort in the context of physical exertion, exercise, especially endurance exercise. But this is a feeling that is perceived also during mental tasks, such as, especially those that require mental concentration, focusing attention for a prolonged period of time. And also, very importantly, when you have to self-regulate your own behavior. So for example, if you put a nice gelato in front of me and I haven't eaten for a while because I'm trying to lose weight, the suppressing, if you like, the urge to eat it, that would require mental effort, and I will perceive that effort. And it's also expressed in the face. So there is a facial expression of effort, and this is an alternative way to measure it, which we have done some work on it. Also from a social psychology point of view, I think it's interesting that it's expressed and the function of it. However, most of the measurement, especially in the field of sport and exercise sciences, has been done using very simple self-reported scales, such as the RPE scale. So, which is a very simple scale that goes, the original one from 6 to 20, you also have ones that goes from 0 to 10, 0 to 100, etc. Importantly, this is a psychophysical construct. A lot of people, I think, sometimes they forget that. So it's about the relationship between the perceptual response, in this case, RPE, ratings of perceived exertion, and the physical workload. So the speed or the power output at which you are exercising. We shouldn't really forget that. And the the two main components of perceived exertion during exercise are, of course, the effort of if you're doing some sort of locomotion, of the locomotor muscle. So if you're cycling, the leg effort, as you can see in this slide. Do you have Andy, do you have a pointer somewhere, just in case? Yeah, otherwise I'll just, yeah. But also, importantly, what is called exertional dyspnea or respiratory effort, which is also experienced especially during whole body exercise. And as you can see here, both of them increase with increase in workload, as you would expect. But importantly, and very important from an endurance performance point of view, even at a fixed workload, over time, as you can see from those two, the two figures on the right, it will increase over time. And of course, at higher intensity, it will increase more quickly. At lower intensity, it will increase less quickly. But eventually, if you continue for long enough, you will reach a point at which perception of effort, even if at the beginning it could even feel very easy, you will eventually reach a point where perception of effort will feel maximal. And that's the key to understand the role of perception of effort in endurance performance, is the increase in perception of effort over time, which is what I'm going to create. Thank you. Cheers. I think it's this one, yes. So in terms of endurance performance, the classical question is related to this in exercise physiology. So this is the Beijing Olympic 10K race. The bold line is the winner. And as you can see, during the race, I need to do this. You will have some people drop off the pace of the winner here, 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 and eventually here, and losing the gold medal. So the basic question in exercise physiology has been why people, which is a basic question about fatigue in our field, is why couldn't these people, I mean, they're talking about elite athletes here, why couldn't they keep the pace of the winner? What made them slow down at these points in time? And of course, the classical answer to that has been that it's because they reached some sort of physiological limit. In the old days, the focus was very much into oxygen delivery and building up of lactic acid in the muscle. This is a quote from 1926, a very old textbook of physiology. And of course, over the time, we added central fatigue. So actually, this physiological model is not brainless. The brain is included, but only in terms of motor function. Obviously, if you look at longer duration exercise, you need to include hypothermia and glycogen depletion, and there's been a lot of research on inhibitory afferent feedback. But regardless of the specific mechanisms, the assumption is that muscle fatigue, both caused by peripheral or central mechanism, will eventually lead to a reduction in muscle power output that will eventually limit performance. That's the very basic assumption of this model, and it's represented here. So if you put somebody, we all know time to exhaustion time. If you put somebody at a given pace, at a fixed pace, progressively there will be a reduction in maximal power output, which we call muscle fatigue. And when the maximal power output that you can exert will be coinciding with the power output required by exercise, or in the case of the Beijing Olympic race, with the speed of the winner, then you will, in the lab, you can only stop because you cannot slow down. In a race, you will slow down. However, when I went in the literature to find for this, from the data on which this assumption is based, I couldn't really find them. So I did a very simple study with some undergraduate students, actually. And when we actually measured power output during a time to exhaustion test, this is what we found. So we found, as expected, of course, because muscle fatigue is a real phenomenon, a nice and quite significant reduction in maximal power output. So there was significant muscle fatigue. However, as you can see, the power output immediately after exhaustion was significantly higher than the power that was required by the time to exhaustion test. Actually, there's been, obviously, some people were not, including a person that I eventually hired in my department, Mark Burley. Some physiologists were not very happy, and they said, but the cadence is different, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, but now these findings being replicated by other labs. So, for example, here a study looking at maximal power output at rest, and then after an incremental exercise, like a VO2 max test, an incremental exercise test, both in hypoxia and normoxia. And as you can see here, in both conditions, there is, even at the end of an incremental exercise, so the final power output is even higher than a time to exhaustion test, you still have a significant difference in maximal power output. So immediately after exhaustion, your actual neuromuscular system is capable of producing the power. In this study, actually, they did occlusion between exhaustion and the maximal power test in order to take muscle biopsies and actually measure how much energy, metabolic energy, was still available in the muscles, and which was 17 to 80 millimoles per kilo of wet mass of ATP, which is the energy currency in the whole body, but also in the muscle. And they calculated for how long, from a purely bioenergetic point of view. So if you adopt the critical power model, you'll be very familiar with this. From a purely bioenergetic point of view, for how long they could have kept going after reaching VO2 max at VO2 max. And of course, everybody has done a VO2 max test, knows very well. It feels that you can't keep going for, even a few seconds. Actually, they calculated that people could have continued to exercise for another 7 to 8 minutes at VO2 max after exhaustion. So clearly there is, I think the idea that the limit is purely physiological is being challenged, to say the least. So we need an alternative way, I think, of explaining this, of explaining endurance performance, and that's the psychobiological model. And actually, the reason why I call it psychobiological is simply because it integrates psychology, especially motivation psychology and cognitive neuroscience, with exercise physiology. So it's a mix of psychology and physiology. So the basic principles are that we should consider even a simple test like a time to exhaustion test as a goal-directed behavior. And of course, if you consider even a simple laboratory test, and even more so a competition in the field as a behavior, that's the science that explains that behavior is psychology. So you should be able to explain endurance performance using psychological constructs and theories, which is the psychological level of the model. But of course, as I said, as we will see later, I work on the assumption that our psychology is generated by the brain, and therefore you should be able to investigate the kind of neurobiological substrates of the psychology that determines performance. And in terms of the constructs, they vary depending on the time to exhaustion, on the endurance test or the kind of competition. But I will stick, because I don't have enough time to exhaustion test. And the two constructs are perception of effort, which are already seen, and potential motivation. Potential motivation, actually, this construct comes from a general theory of motivation, which is called motivation intensity theory, which was proposed by Brehm in 1989 to explain effort during any kind of motivated behavior. Actually, there's not even mentioning of exercise in these papers. But it works, as you will see in a few seconds, it works very well in the context of exercise. So the idea is that the motivational factors, such as the reward, the need for the reward, determine only the maximal effort that you're willing to exert in a task, which is what we call potential motivation. But up to that level, which is determined by the classic motivational factors, people will exert only the effort required to accomplish the task. So there is a disconnection between the actual effort exerted and the maximal effort that that you're willing to exert. So I think that's, from a psychological theory point of view, that's the main contribution, which is very useful in many settings. The one that is useful to me in terms of endurance performance, it explains when people disengage from a task. And by disengaging from a task, meaning when people decide to basically reduce effort. which is seen in this kind of vertical line. And they decide to reduce effort when when the effort required by the task reach the level of potential motivation. And actually, this is a theoretical graphical representation of the model, but if you actually apply to exercise, it looks, and if you consider effort as perception of effort, you will see that it actually fits and looks like what we see in the lab every day. So for example, let's look at this dashed line here. And of course, if a person has low potential motivation for the same perception of effort, it will stop earlier than in a condition of higher potential motivation. And when potential motivation is constant, people that will have, for example, a higher perception of effort will reach the same level of maximal effort that they're willing to exert earlier than somebody who is, for example, fitter and will perceive the same task to be less effortful. So the combination of potential motivation and perception of effort will determine when you disengage from a task and therefore time to exhaustion. The interesting, I think the beauty of this application of motivation intensity theory is it can explain the effects of both physiological and psychological manipulations on endurance performance, specifically in this case, time to exhaustion. So the first one, the example that I use is muscle fatigue. And actually this was a bit difficult to get it through reviewers because in the same paper, I demonstrated that muscle fatigue is important for endurance performance, but at the same time, I said it's not the limiting factor for endurance performance. So they were a bit confused by that, but I think you will, the model actually explains why. So what we did, we induced muscle fatigue experimentally before the time to exhaustion test using 100 drop jumps. And we did it with 20 seconds rest in between jumps so that we didn't have any build-up of lactic acid. So there was a long-lasting muscle fatigue, but just by disrupting the excitation, basically it's the excitation-contraction coupling that is impaired, no metabolic disturbances. And then after that, we asked the subject to go on a time to exhaustion, and we compared it to a condition where there was no pre-fatigue. And unsurprisingly, I guess, there was a significant reduction in time to exhaustion when you pre-fatigued the leg muscles. And again, you will say, okay, that's obvious. But actually, interestingly, the muscle fatigue, when we induced muscle fatigue before the time to exhaustion test, the time to exhaustion test didn't further induce muscle fatigue, only in the control condition. So we couldn't explain the reduction in time to exhaustion with muscle fatigue being the limiting factor. So we need something else, another explanation for this effect. And the explanation is here. So again, unsurprisingly, when you exercise with fatigue locomotor muscle, perception of effort is higher. And as predicted, they reach the maximal level of effort that they're willing to exert, potential motivation, earlier than in the control condition. So the main parameter that could explain the reduction in performance was actually perception of effort. What is more, I think, interesting and more important to test the model is to see whether we can actually manipulate performance by changing perception of effort in a way that the physiology is not affected. And we did this with mental fatigue. So we induced mental fatigue experimentally using a very demanding cognitive task on a computer for 90 minutes non-stop, which, believe me, it's very tiring. And after that, we did exactly the same kind of test that we used for the previous study with the locomotor muscle fatigue. And we found basically almost the same effect as the muscle fatigue manipulation. So a significant reduction in time to exhaustion. But we couldn't explain it in any, so we measured a lot of physiological variables and nothing changed. No cardiorespiratory factor, no neuromuscular factors. The only variable that changed with mental fatigue was perception of effort, which was higher in a mentally fatigued state. And as a result, again, it led to reaching the maximum level of effort earlier than in the control condition. So both the effects of muscle fatigue, or physical fatigue, or however you want to call it, and mental fatigue, and obviously the mechanism, the underlying mechanisms are very different, but ultimately, at psychological level, the effect is the same, is an increase in perception of effort. And as a result, the behavior is also, which is the time to exhaustion, is affected in a similar way. Because psychologically, the effect is very similar. So what about perception of effort in a health context rather than a performance context? This is actually my own, as you can tell, I'm not an endurance athlete or I'm not actually even a fan of endurance performance. The only reason why I study endurance athletes is because fatigue is very important in endurance athletes, and I think we need to understand how it works in healthy people before we actually understand. You cannot understand the pathophysiology if you don't know the physiology of something. So first we need to understand where this perception of effort comes from, and after that, we can only apply that to patients. But my heart actually is, and the reason why I've moved into this field is to understand this, is to understand fatigue in patients, because of my mom and also, unfortunately, also my wife recently. So fatigue in a clinical population is a very complex construct, has different symptoms and manifestation and impact, but one of the features that is often, because usually it's measured with questionnaires that relate to feelings at rest, this is actually often kind of overlooked, which is that fatigue in these patients is also associated with an increase in perception of effort. So this is actually from Macmillan leaflet about fatigue, and there is a cancer patient talking about his own experience. And when you talk about the experience of fatigue, they often tell you things that are about effort. So for example, he's talking about mental fatigue as well here, but actually that even very simple physical tasks of activities of daily living, such as getting off the bed, brushing your teeth, or really doing very simple things, when you are fatigued, they feel like you are almost doing a marathon. They feel really, really hard. And no surprise that actually their quality of life is affected, because if every time, even going off a bed, it feels like climbing a hill, a lot of people would not like that to happen every day. So perception of effort is integral to the experience of fatigue in patients. And we actually have some, these are unpublished data, which I collected in breast cancer patients. So we took a group of relatively, these are the ones that could come to the lab. So actually, these are not actually the worst. You can be affected even more by fatigue. So cancer patient undergoing chemotherapy for breast cancer. And we test them at baseline, so just 1 or 2 days before the chemo session, and 1 or 2 days after the chemo session. And they always, chemotherapy is often associated with an exacerbation of fatigue. And as you can see, although, these people have been through surgery, most of them have been through already some cycles of chemo. So already at baseline, they have a significantly higher perception of effort. They were exercising on a bike at 3.3 METs. The physiologists here know what this means. It means this is like walking. It's not high intensity exercise whatsoever. It's a very light to moderate intensity exercise. As you can see already at baseline, they had a significantly higher perception of effort compared to the healthy people. These are the age and sex matched patients, healthy, measured over the same period of time. But what's very interesting is that, and as expected, perception of effort increased even further after chemo. We measured every physiological parameter that we could. Basically, everything from the neck down, we measure everything. Metabolism, cardiac output, hemoglobin, respiratory function, muscle function, everything. Because we expected chemotherapy for breast cancer to have some acute effects on the physiological capacity to exercise. But actually, there was no change in any of the physiological variables, to my surprise, to be honest. The only change was in their perception of effort, which to me suggests that there was a direct effect of the chemotherapy in the brain. But of course, now we are following this up with some electroencephalography study to understand exactly what's the effect of chemotherapy on the brain from a neurophysiological point of view. But it shows, I mean, what feels basically very light, 10 on a scale is like very light. After chemotherapy, this is working, it feels kind of hard, somewhat hard. I mean, and these are the good ones, the patient that could actually come to the lab after the chemo. The patient really affected by fatigue, they couldn't even, it would feel 20, which is maximal effort. They cannot even come to the lab. So it's a serious problem, and I think one that is worth studying. Obviously, I think it's also related to a more general problem in the general population, which is the fact that a lot of people do not meet the guidelines for physical activity. So, for example, these are about leisure time physical activity in the States. And this is actually by questionnaire, so it's probably an overestimation. But only 29% of the female population in the States meet the guidelines for physical activity in their leisure time. 71% basically decide in their leisure time to get engaged with sedentary leisure time activities, such as watching TV, reading, internet. And I think that perception of effort is a major factor that determines this choice. In fact, if you look at the literature about barriers, perceived barriers to exercise, and a lot of people cite time. That's why the high-intensity interval training is quite popular, because the idea is that you reduce the time expenditure. But actually, one of the 4 main barriers that comes out, for example, from this analysis, is actually what they call physical exertion, or the fatigue and the perception of effort associated with exercise. And indeed, for example, these are data from female university students. And if you look, obviously social factors important, for example, where the facilities are located, but the items that rate the highest when you do this kind of questionnaires often are items related to fatigue and effort and perceived exertion. And this is even more so in patients with chronic disease. So for example, if you're trying to rehabilitate, to exercise people, to improve their function, people that have all sorts of neuromuscular, orthopedic, cardiovascular, or a variety of chronic diseases, the main exercise barriers in all this patient population is perceived exertion, perceived fatigue. So I think that by understanding perception of effort, as hopefully I will have time to show you later, we may be able to help people to be more physically active. But of course, we need to understand where this perception of effort comes from. And I think that although there are some alternative models, I think perception of effort is like any other perception. I cannot see why it should be any different. Basically, is generated by brain processing of neural signals. So there are 2 steps. First of all, the intensity or the magnitude of the neural signals. And the second step is the brain processing. Changes in both of these steps can generate a difference in perception of effort. But the main debate is about where the signals come from. And most people, me including, before I really started to study perception of effort, my naive understanding was that perception of effort comes from signals related to peripheral, and by peripheral I mean below the neck, signals. So signal related to heart rate, for example, or signal related to, I don't know, the metabolic stress in the active muscles. And I understand why, I was the same, because if you read literature about perception of effort in exercise physiology, you see that it correlates with a variety of physiological variables. For example, heart rate. These are data on 2,500 people. And you can see there is a nice correlation between ratings of perceived exertion and heart rate. There is also the neurophysiological machinery. The heart is innervated with sensory fibers, and there are pathways that relay signals from the heart to the brain. So it is possible to get a signal from the heart to the brain. However, both this and this is not enough to prove a cause and effect. you need to do experiments. And actually, when you experimentally manipulate, rather than just looking at the correlation, because to be honest, doing incremental exercise, everything will go up. Almost everything will go up. So you can correlate everything with everything. It's not really a proof of a cause and effect. You need to do experiments. And when you look at the experiments, for example, this one, where they reduced heart rate during exercise, this is the control condition. They reduced heart rate during exercise using some pharmacological beta blockers, so some pharmacological manipulation. If heart rate or signals related to heart rate were processed by the brain to generate perception of effort, you would expect a reduction in perception of effort, right? But actually, there is no change or even an increase in perception of effort when you take these drugs. So, and also if you have a heart transplant or even a double lung and heart transplant, the American Heart Association suggests you should use perception of effort to regulate your exercise intensity, because despite not having connection whatsoever between the heart and the brain, you can still, you still have a normal perception of effort that you can use to prescribe exercise. So clearly, signals from the heart, forget about that. What about the muscles? Again, strong correlation between RPE, for example, and blood lactate, which is a measure of kind of metabolic stress in the muscle. And again, we have a lot of connection, a lot of receptors in the muscles that can relay information about tension and also metabolic stress. But again, what about experimental evidence? One way to test the theory is to stimulate these peripheral receptors. And one way of doing it is to inject in the muscle. In this case, they injected hypertonic saline. Everybody that had, like, in the sea and some water, salty water in the eye, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It stings, right? This is the same thing, but inside the muscle. So it induced quite considerable amount of pain, as you can see here. But this is okay, I don't have time to explain the details. It's called a production method. This is a measure of perception of effort in reverse. And there was, despite significant pain, because there was no motor impairment, there was no change in perception of effort whatsoever. So this experiment shows very nicely that signals from the muscle are important, but important for example, pain. Also other functions as well. But in terms of perception, for pain. But they do not provide a sensory signal for perception of effort. This is also proven by studies where the sensory signal from the legs during cycling have been blocked at spinal level with pharmacological blockades, with the anesthetic, okay? And again, if these signals were important for perception of effort, you would expect a reduction in perception of effort during cycling, because leg effort is a very important source of perceived exertion during cycling. But actually, with the epidural anesthesia, perception of effort is higher than in the control condition. So not only there's no change, it's actually higher. And you'd ask why? Why, son? How is it possible that it's higher? Because although they were careful not to impair motor function, there was still, with this anesthetic, or lidocaine, a little bit of motor impairment. It was not just the sensory function which was affected, also a little bit so there about 20–25% reduction in muscle strength. And of course, to cycle at the same power output, they had to increase the center motor command from the brain to the muscles, obviously through the spine, to overcome the slight block at spinal level. And actually, this is what is perceived as exertion. What is perceived as effort is the calorie discharge, a copy of the central motor command that you send to the active muscles. In the case of respiratory effort, is a calorie discharge coming from the medullary respiratory centers. So this calorie discharge is what we perceive as effort, is how intensely your brain is trying or is driving your muscles. And that includes not only the primary motor cortex, includes all the brain areas that lead to eventually to a voluntary muscle contraction. And there is a lot of indirect evidence for this. What was missing was direct neurophysiological evidence for it, which we did, which we produced using electroencephalography, which is measuring brain activity, electrical brain activity, and with a very sophisticated averaging and signal analysis, you extract from all that's going on in the brain, which is a lot, the so-called motor-related cortical potential, so which is the brain activity specifically related to movement, okay? And in the first study that we did, we asked people to lift a submaximal weight. You have to lift it 50 times to get the signal from the brain, because you need to do this averaging. But importantly, so we asked people to lift 2 weights, high and low weight. But also, we pre-fatigue one of the arms with eccentric exercise, similarly to what we did with the drop jumps, but with the eccentric elbow flexor contractions. So we cause significant muscle fatigue in one arm. So by combining 2 different weights and the fatigue versus non-fatigue arm, we created 4, if you like, experimental conditions with 4 different levels of perceived effort, as you can see here. And we measured brain activity during these 4 different conditions, which is this. So 0 is the onset of the muscle contraction, or DMG to be precise. This is brain activity before the movement. And the first 2 seconds here, the contraction was 2 seconds. This is brain activity during the movement. And as you can see, brain activity, it follows the condition. So for example, the red lines are the fatigue arm compared to the blue lines, which is the control arm. So as expected, in order to lift the same weight with fatigue muscle, you need to increase motor command. And we actually not just assumed it, but we actually measured it. But importantly, by measuring it, we also explored the correlation between this brain activity with perception of effort. And we found a significant correlation between the two. So we demonstrated experimentally that central motor command correlates with perception of effort. And I will skip this one because I want to. More recently, there's been actually direct experimental evidence by actually disrupting the premotor and motor areas using a theta burst, which is like it's a kind of magnetic stimulation that impairs or modulates brain activity for a prolonged period of time. And they did the supplementary motor area, the primary motor cortex, also the precuneus as a control condition. And they measured effort, physical effort, in 4 different ways, which I don't have time to describe. They did a very good study. And the only stimulation that changed effort in all 4 different paradigms, including RPE, was the stimulation of the supplementary motor area, which is an area upstream of the primary motor cortex, which is something that Gandevia suggested many, many years ago. That actually, the color discharge for perception of effort doesn't come from the primary motor cortex, comes from the cortical areas upstream of the primary motor cortex, the ones that actually activate the primary motor cortex itself. And one of them is the anterior singular cortex, the ACC. In this study, they used, so people were cycling submaximal, and they used hypnosis to convince people they were doing either flat, uphill, or downhill. But they were actually cycling at exactly the same intensity. But they were convinced that they were cycling at different intensity. And perception of effort was significantly different in the 3 conditions. Importantly, they also measure with PET, they measure brain activity, and they found that one of the areas, the ones that correlate with changes in perception of effort, is the anterior singular cortex, which is also the area that we stimulated with the cognitive task in the mental fatigue study. But importantly, there is also further evidence that the anterior singular cortex is important for effort or effort-based decision-making, because if you damage the anterior singular cortex in a rat, the rat becomes lazy. And by lazy, I mean, it's called a T-maze. So they have a choice, either go right and get 4 pieces of cheese, or go left and get 1 piece of cheese. But to get the 4 pieces of cheese, they have to go over a barrier. So they have to climb a barrier. And normal rats, they tend to go right most of the time. So they are willing to exert the effort required to get the extra cheese. But when you damage the anterior cingulate cortex, they don't go right very often. So become lazy. And of course, we cannot ask perception of effort in rats. But my interpretation that this may be due to an alteration in perception of effort, but obviously is a speculation. How much time do I have, Andy, left?
20 minutes.
Oh, great.
Well, 10 minutes in the session.
Okay. So I'll skip actually this. And I want to tell you now what is a bit of, again, when you talk about evolutionary things, sometimes it's quite speculative, but I think it's interesting and it's something to think about, is that what is the ultimate cause, so the adaptive function of perception of effort. And I quickly show the central governor model. The original idea is that perception of effort is part of a system that is designed or has evolved better to prevent you from killing yourself during exercise. So for example, to prevent myocardial ischemia during exercise, which, by the way, we know it happens in millions of people every day, if the physiological system they maintain homeostasis in the heart is defective. So it doesn't seem to be really correct. But what I've proposing now, also for discussion, because it's quite a new thing that I got into, is actually perception of effort is part of a big system that is, the ultimate function is to regulate body fat, specifically to avoid body fat to go too low. Because human being, not me, even a very lean human being, like this fit lady, compared to our ancestors, we are basically, as a species, forget about the obese people. As a species, we are fat. So if you look at a relative, close relative, a bonobo, a female will have 3.6% body fat. A human being at this percent, well, I don't think that even the most shredded bodybuilder, female bodybuilder won't get to this level and probably stop menstruating, you know, and have all sorts of problems. Like even a fit female would be about 20%, 25% body fat. Why? Why is it good to be fat? Actually, there are a lot of fitness functions of body fat, because these days we tend to look at this. We tend to look at the fact that if you're too fat, for example, you die earlier. This is mortality. So this is BMI. The fatter you are, the higher the BMI, the more likely you are to die prematurely because of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, this didn't really happen when we evolved. This wasn't a problem. The problem was this one. If you are too skinny, you are more likely to die, which is something that a lot of people don't know about. But my PhD was on cachexia, so I know this quite well. So if you are too skinny, you're more likely to die. Why? Well, one reason is, for example, is that your immune response, for example, if you have an injury or an infection, is impaired. But what seems to be the key reason for why we evolved this system to keep us quite fat compared to our cousins is actually that we need to buffer the high energy requirements of the brain. So human beings, of course, we develop quite a large brain for our body size, and that gives us advantages, survival advantages, because we are smarter, we can change our environment, et cetera, et cetera. But that came to an energetic cost. So in order to be protected from periods of energy, of low energy availability, we had to build a bigger buffer, which is in the energy storage, which is body fat. Because, of course, these days, this is not really, being too lean is not really a problem if you live in a modern society, because this is the environment in which we live. We have plenty of food, high density, high caloric density, And these days, you don't even need to go to the supermarket with a trolley. You can actually do it online. They bring it to you. So really, no exertion whatsoever to get food. We dissociated food from physical activity. That's the key. And in those days, it wasn't like this. It was like this. So when we evolved, there wasn't much food around. And on the top of that, we had to work very hard to get it, either by gathering food or by hunting animals. And, for example, a persistent hunt, they calculated that it would take about 2,000 calories. And we know from history, unfortunately, when you combine little food with a lot of physical activity, this happens. You get really lean, and you're more likely to die, to get infections and die. In fact, a lot of people in the Nazi camps died because they couldn't survive, for example, even a simple infection. So, of course, you need a system that tries to maintain fat as much as possible. By doing what? By making you eat as much food as you can when it's available, which is my problem. And also, important, and we know a lot about this. Leptin is only one of many. The biology of what drives food intake has been studied quite intensively. We don't know much about the biology of energy expenditure, especially the regulation of physical activity from a biological point of view. We know much less. And although we are well-designed, well-adapted to be endurance runners, because in those days, apparently, endurance running was very important for hunting, also, we evolved a tendency to avoid exertion. Not in general, when it's unnecessary, because exertion in those days was necessary, for example, to find food. So you need to exert effort, and you need to be nice and fit to exert effort when you need food, for example. But when you don't need food, when there is an alternative, you should choose the alternative that is easier and less costly from an energetic point of view. And in psychology, we know this for a long time. I mean, the principle of least effort, which is included in motivation intensity theory, by the way, I mean, it goes down, from the 19th century. So it's been recognized that anything else equal, people tend to choose the easy option. You can see that on campus, I don't know, maybe here as well, that even if a nicely laid path, I mean, how much really energy do you save by doing that? But if you do it every day, if there's no food around, doing that may be the difference between you being a little bit fatter and survive when there is not much food around or whatever, an infection, an epidemic, or whatever, than somebody who does this. And there's been even people, really nice sociological, because I know that you have a strong social sciences here in Sterling, so I put that in. It's a very good book. Actually, this tendency to avoid effort actually, they say the origins of inhumanity, I mean, led to very inhumane things, such as slavery. What is slavery? It's a way to avoid effort, to get food, or the money to get food and whatever you need, without doing work yourself. You get somebody else to do it. And of course, is also the reason why we built the so-called hypokinetic environment. But, I mean, these guys, they're going to the gym. They're not lazy in the negative and kind of colloquial meaning of the term. But they are lazy, they choose, for example, the escalator, because if your goal is to get big biceps, taking the stairs is an unnecessary kind of exertion. So you go to the gym, you do a lot of effort because you get what you want, let's say big biceps, but you avoid effort when it's unnecessary. And if that's your goal, it's better to take the stairs because it's unnecessary to go up the stairs. And I think, again, so the same model can be applied to that. And the main, in public health promotion of psychology, the main, most of the interventions are about increasing motivation. So helping people to engage with physical activity by increasing motivation. The problem with telling people that they should exercise because it's good for you from a health point of view is one. Because 10 minutes, okay, very quickly. Everybody wants to be healthy. Health is a good thing. The problem is that when you do exercise every day, they tell you, if you do exercise, you will be less likely to get heart attack in 20 years' time. The delay of the reward is very long if you think in terms of gaining health, and also is probabilistic. So if we told people, if it was true that if you don't work every day, you die tomorrow of heart attack, everybody would be doing it. It's the contingency of the task exercise with the reward that is the problem. So the other alternative is to reduce perception of effort, which is what I'm trying to do. And I proposed this thing in an editorial, which was a bit, maybe we can use, and it's not only drugs, you can also use psychological techniques to reduce perception of effort and help people become more physically active by reducing perception of effort rather than just increasing the motivation, which is a good thing if you can. But a lot of people, because it looks like a bit like cheating. But actually, using drug to support a behavior change has been done before. If you think about nicotine patches, what you do, use a pharmacological manipulation to reduce the urge to smoke, so they require less effort to inhibit, not to smoke. So you're changing effort by reducing the urge to quit that would require effort if it was there. And what I'm planning to do is to actually use caffeine, because we know caffeine reduces perception of effort, is a widely available psychoactive drug, is cheap, and is also tasty if you get it in an espresso. Not in the coffee that you drink, but in espresso is nice. And actually, just very quickly, because I want to have some discussion, basically we did a study where we compared 3 training sessions with caffeine, with 3 training sessions, high-intensity interval training sessions. As you can see here, this is heart rate. So they did, these were kind of sedentary, inactive people, and they did 4 bouts of high-intensity interval training. And with caffeine or no caffeine, physiologically, exactly the same intensity. But as you would expect, perception of effort is significantly lower in the caffeine condition compared to placebo. And importantly, what we found is this one, is that we were able to modify their choice. So despite not knowing which one was caffeine, which one was not, 80% of the people, when asked to choose which training session they preferred, they chose the training session with caffeine. So we shifted their choice significantly with caffeine. So it's like an initial behavioral result that we may actually change behavior using caffeine. Of course, we need to do a long-term study where we look at the effects of caffeine on the dropout rates in participation in people that start exercise, and then over a period of a few months, they drop out. We all know that a lot of people, maybe they can find enough motivation to start, but it's very difficult to keep them exercising. And I think with caffeine, we may be able to help them to stay active for a prolonged period of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. That's really interesting because Sam and I went for donuts and coffee before we came here this morning.
Yeah.
So there's some scientific rationale.
That's my fattening system working very well.
But then I didn't give Sam a choice. We walked up the hill through Bridge of Allen to work off the donut after some caffeine.
Yeah.
Right, open it up to some questions. And Sam, if you can remember to repeat the question.
Yes.
For the camera.
Yeah, but very interested to hear your motivation in cancer-related fatigue. For those of us who, like you and I, have seen that at very close hand, it's very difficult intuitively to accept that there is no physiological story well-known phenomenon in the cancer business called chemo brain, which is the mental, I suppose,
The fog. Yeah.
That comes from that treatment.
Yeah.
I just want to push back a bit on what you said and ask whether you think there might not be some physiological toxicity effects that have just not yet really been measured or observed. You know, it's very hard when you look at neuropathic effects and the alterations in sensory and liver function that you get from that treatment.
Yeah.
To believe that there's nothing going on there.
Yeah. So the question is about the mechanism of increased perception of effort in chemotherapy, whether there is a physiological mechanism or not. Absolutely. So there is a very nice quote from a well-forgotten paper in Journal of Applied Physiology. Psychology is a special phase of brain physiology. So when I talk about psychology, I'm not talking about something pie in the skies. I mean, that's the emergent property of brain activity. So we are talking about brain physiology at a different level, but that's is the function of the brain. So for me, psychology and physiology, we talk in that way, and but there's no disconnection. It's just different level of expression of the same thing. So I absolutely, when I said there was no physiological effect, I meant from the neck down, in terms of the physiological system that we know are important to support exercise. I would have expected, for example, some changes in cardiovascular function, because we know chronically some of these drugs have cardiotoxicity. So I thought maybe they could have had some kind of acute effect that might impair cardiovascular function and lead to muscle fatigue, and because you have more muscle fatigue, you feel more effort. But we couldn't find any of that. So I think the physiological effect is there, but it's in the brain. And it's expressed psychologically as an increase in perception of effort, as chemo brain, as tiredness, even at rest. But what's going on there in the brain in terms of the alterations, we don't know. That's the next stage, using, for example, electroencephalography to find out during, because I'm interested in the fatigue during exercise, if you're in the perception of effort. You can also feel fatigue at rest. You feel tired. That's not exactly, they're connected, but they're not exactly, it's not the same sensation. So I absolutely think it's all connected, and it's induced clearly by the chemo, because it was a significant increase immediately after. And I don't think it's not only the psychological response to it. Our patients, they were quite positive. I mean, they came to the lab, for a start. So there was a little bit of a changes in mood and stuff, but you couldn't really explain the increase in perception of effort with that. I don't know, which one? Andy, you decide. Absolutely, yeah. I think exactly, because you shouldn't look at, you have to look at it from a completely different perspective. It's not about homeostasis during exercise. We are talking about, the time scale is weeks, months, years. It's not the tiny, as I've shown you with the people cutting through the grass. How much energy do you save there? I mean, that's not gonna threaten you immediately. But it's when you are in a situation like we were when we evolved, that we had to do physical activity all the time. Even those little savings here and there, they might have meant a difference in body fat between the person that, let's say, higher perception of effort than somebody else, which meant that it survived, it reproduced, and I think that's how it has evolved. The time frame is completely different. Is tiny, small difference in people that have perception of effort compared to people that didn't, or they have it less, that made this evolution. No, it's not the tiny saving that you make immediately. And I think also that's why I think the reason why you have this increase in perception over time. So it correlates with intensity. So the higher the intensity, of course, the higher the energy expenditure. But if anything, it's prolonged exercise that consumes more energy. So that makes sense why, that's why I think we have this progressive increase in perception of effort over time, even if you are energetically, from a rate point of view, you're maybe doing low intensity, because over time, the expenditure, total expenditure, not the rate, could be quite high. So you need something to stop you, keep going, even at a low intensity for too long. So that's, I think, the answer. But it's difficult to, unfortunately, it's difficult to test these theories. But clearly, this tendency to avoid effort is there. That's proven experimentally.
Have you applied any of this work to depression in terms of the separation of physiological and the brain activity?
Yeah.
And linked to that, the new theories around depression of neurogenesis, which are really fascinating because it may lead to new treatment systems where the number of brain cells being created daily is reduced due to
Yeah. No, I haven't done any research specifically on depression, but of course, when you study fatigue, depression is one of the first things you study, because there is fatigue, profound fatigue, could be one of the main symptoms of depression. So there is clearly a link there. However, and this is why, for example, one of the first treatments that they tried, for example, in cancer patients, was antidepressants, because the idea is that serotonin is involved, et cetera, et cetera. In fatigue patients with no depression, if you're depressed, you're probably fatigued. So there is a link there. But let's take non-depressed people with fatigue, which can happen. Because, 90% of cancer patients probably suffer from fatigue to a degree or another. Not 90% of patients have depression. So they gave antidepressants to cancer patients without depression, and there was no change in fatigue whatsoever. So it looks like if you're depressed, of course, you need to cure your depression. That will help you with fatigue and also perception of effort. We know depressed people have higher perception of effort during exercise tasks than people who are not depressed. But if you're not depressed, that pathway doesn't seem to really apply. It's something else, and we think it's about the dopamine. The studies in rats, for example, suggest it's the dopamine and adenosine, which is not a neurotransmitter, is a neuromodulator in the brain. There's a link between these two pathways, if you like. I think that's, from a neurochemical point of view, that's where is more likely to be the problem.
Right, one more question, and then we'll chat with the beers here. Beers are good.
My question is more from the perspective of performance sports rather than health. And I know you've done some work in team sports or in mental fatigue.
Yes.
Perception of effort there. So my two-part question is, one, do you think mental fatigue is an issue in sports of football, for example?
Yeah.
And if it is, do you have any immediate recommendations on
Yeah, we just submitted a review on that. So, if anything, although even in endurance sports, people I think underestimate how much cognitive demanding is an endurance sport. But of course, in team sports, the cognitive demand is quite obvious, right? You need to sustain attention, react to stimuli for 90 minutes in football, for example. So the high cognitive demand. So if anything, in team sports, is even worse, the impact, because it has an impact on the physical endurance, and we measure that with the yo-yo test, so we know. But on the top of that, it impairs. We did passing and shooting test. There was an impairment on that. Also, there was an impairment on decision-making. So it's like a double whammy. It impairs your physical performance as a football player, which is obviously endurance is important, and it impairs cognitive performance, technical and tactical performance. It doesn't impair, though, maximal sprinting. And we also found it in many other studies. So short-term maximal exercise, strength, and power for few seconds kind of exertion is not affected by mental fatigue. But anything that requires endurance and requires cognitive function, it's impaired. So yeah, it's really bad. And what can you do? There are many things you can do. One is to try, it's difficult to reduce the cognitive load because you need to pay attention and stuff. One way, obviously, is to reduce mental fatigue, for example, before a game. So by adjusting what you do before a game. Sleep is very important because sleep is associated with mental fatigue, and a lot of people cannot sleep. Look at what's going on also in the personal life of players, try to reduce the psychological stressors. And of course, you can also use like caffeine, for example, especially in halftime, and I know some people use it, so that you get you reduce some of the mental fatigue in the second half because of the caffeine.
Thanks very much, Sam.
Thank you.